Let's just set the scene for people at this point so they can understand where we are. About an hour ago, we got the news that the SEC was charging Elon Musk with fraud, misleading statements, false statements that led to a move in Tesla's stock price that they describe, at least, was for the benefit of perhaps defeating short sellers that had become his nemesis. That, at least, is one part of this complaint that goes on in a number of different areas, talking about reckless behavior in not knowing that his statements were false and misleading, omitting material facts, premised on a long series of baseless assumptions and contrary to facts that Mr. Musk knew at the time. Of course, this refers to that series of tweets, one of the key ones being funding secured that took place on the 8th of August that did have the effect of sending up Tesla's stock price on the news that he was pursuing a go-private transaction. The SEC claims that caused market chaos and harmed Tesla investors. Set off a trading frenzy, says the SEC, and the trading volume and price of Tesla did immediately spike thereafter. They do seek to bar Mr. Musk as an officer or director of a publicly traded company. That is typically what they look for in actions like this. Important to note, the complaint is against just Mr. Musk. It does not include Tesla itself. And there are any number of defenses I think we're going to start to hear from Mr. Musk in terms of his behavior on that day and why, in fact, he felt that it was a correct statement to say that funding had been secured. The company citing what they believe were quite a few meetings that Mr. Musk had had with the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia, in which he was led to believe that they were fully behind the idea of taking the company private and would be a source of funds for that effort. They also go on to cite a number of different reasons as well that the SEC should not have taken this action because of the harm that it will bring to shareholders of the company itself. Let me read here one thing that we've got, at least from Tesla, on this inquiry. They say it may have been unusual for someone contemplating a buyout, but Mr. Musk did not approach this as a typical take-private transaction. They say he had no intention of increasing his ownership or control of the company. He had no intention of cashing out of his own equity. He had, in fact, no pecuniary motivation at all. He wanted existing shareholders to remain with the company if that were possible and if they wanted to do so. And so their argument is simply that, in fact, that was not the case. And they go on to say that Mr. Musk may actually have been motivated by correcting a false impression in the market when news of a $2 billion investment was reported in Tesla by the Saudis. He may have been under the mistaken assumption that the news of his conversations about a potential go private had leaked and was simply trying to actually clarify and release to the market all the information that he knew at that time. None of this appears to have been enough, clearly was not, to convince the SEC, Melissa, not to bring today's action, which, again, if they are successful in proving it, would result potentially in fines and in Mr. Musk being removed as a CEO of this company or as an officer or director of any public company.
Just last month, David, the company acknowledged that it had received an informal request from the DOJ, a voluntary request for documents, which many thought was the first step in a fraud investigation. How does this SEC suit dovetail, if at all, with the DOJ investigation?
Unclear, and I have to say I haven't done enough reporting on it to understand. As you well know, we do have cases where, of course, the SEC and the DOJ act together to bring an action, both criminal and civil in nature, against particular companies and or officers of those companies. Think, for example, fraud at a particular company. In this case, the AUSA, perhaps in San Francisco, may continue to be investigating whether or not this rises to the level of criminal activity in nature. But all we know at this point is the SEC chose that it had enough time or enough evidence to move for a civil claim and make its complaint. Important to note, the SEC hasn't done much. Its fiscal year is ending on September 30th. Some have noted that to me as saying they maybe wanted to make their justification for their existence before the end of the fiscal year. I know that may be a cynical take, but you may hear more about that as well.
David, one last question in terms of the SEC's effort, and we might have to go to this press conference now, to potentially bar Elon Musk as being an officer of a publicly traded company. This seems to differ from past instances where this has been done in that he didn't personally gain per se from any sort of fraud. It wasn't insider trading. It wasn't cooking the books.
That is true, and it certainly was not, and the company would make the case that, in fact, typically fraud, when it is prosecuted by the SEC, involves what you just said, perhaps a manipulation of numbers to give a false impression of the fundamentals of the company itself, and when that is then revealed, it impacts the company. They would say it's only because now you have threatened our founder and our most important person that shareholders are going to actually be hurt, Melissa, but nonetheless, they are seeking what they do typically seek in these kinds of cases, which is to have him be in a position where he could no longer serve on a board of directors or as an officer of a company.
All right, David, thank you. David Faber back at headquarters with the very latest on Tesla. Let's trade this. In terms of a 10% decline in the shares that we're seeing right now, Pete Najarian, what do you think that represents? The notion that Elon Musk is taken off in some way, shape, or form, either by force or by voluntary resignation?
I would say the voluntary resignation is unlikely.
Okay.
I would say by force, I could perceive that happening, absolutely. And you know, the financials are what they've been for a long time with Tesla, obviously. So there's a lot of different things that are coming into play here. But if indeed he's removed, I would think that this drop is not just what we're seeing today. I would expect to see more of a drop than what we're seeing right now.
A tremendous drop. And I do think he'll be removed. And I think that when they go after this type of stuff, they want blood. They'll get blood. The SEC is not fooling around. That could mean what Pete's talking about could be a cut in half spot for Tesla. People have been talking about this for a long time.
Cut in half.
Well, I mean, there's a 255, there's a 244. But at the end of the day, cut in half, yes, I'll stick by that.
There is an argument to be made that it would be more bullish for the shares if he were actually removed, because that would remove the greatest uncertainty that's been hanging over the stock.
No, absolutely no. I mean, I've argued for years that this is like a venture capital investment where you have a visionary founder that has this big idea and it shouldn't be valued on fundamentals. If you don't have Elon Musk, then you have to look at the fundamentals, and the fundamentals do not support this stock price at all. I don't think this is bullish for the stock in any way whatsoever.
So, and love you, Brian, and love you for that view. But I think this long-term view that investors have on the stock is the problem, and is that they put blinders on and they say, all I care about is this long-term story. I get it, I get it, I get it. And meanwhile, the fundamentals change every single day. By the way, I would totally push back on the fact that he didn't have anything to gain by these quotes. He's the biggest shareholder of the company. Of course he has something to gain. And in the long run, the challenge of the value of this company, if you are looking to sell it, some are arguing out there that keeping the share price where it is.
On the back of the tweet.
I don't care.
And the stock declined
he owns
afterwards.
The company. He is there to basically argue for the value of the company and say, hey, I've got all kinds of people. By the way, he hadn't even discussed, much less confirmed, as the SEC is quoted in their complaint. I think this is what you're supposed to do when there are rules, and you have to set a standard.
Let's start looking at top 10 holders. When they start to lighten up on the stock, and you see, I know quarterly filings.
We've seen that actually in the latest quarter.
Right.
We've had
so you've seen these top 10 holders, and that's the big thing, because those are the buyers that are sitting there owning the bulk of shares. So to Tim's
blindly?
point,
I mean, so I don't think you're saying. I guess my question
they're
is,
selling it. They're selling it. So for me, I think that you're starting to hit a headwind now with actually the top 10 holders who are the biggest believers in this name. And to Brian's point, I agree totally. This is a guy that is the stock. Without him, there is no stock.
Right. And let's remember, he has loaned his shares against this company. There's potentially margin calls out there. And not only that, the company has to raise money. Just if this didn't happen, the company was going to have to raise money.
To a company
so right now, who's going to give you money? Exactly. This is not no bueno.
Let me so there's been comparisons made to companies that have been so closely identified with its founders, and they turn out fine. And one example is Apple and Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs goes away. Tim Cook steps in, and you know what? Apple hits record high after record high. No problem.
Although
the first Steve Jobs step away, the company almost went out of business.
Yeah.
The first, but the second one I think is important to see. But here's the difference. We knew who Tim Cook was. We actually knew what the hierarchy is.
That was going to be the second,
who is after
second
Elon
part
Musk?
of my point, with a lot of executive departures of late.
And it was set it and forget it back then. You had a distribution in line. All you had to do was sort of sit at the helm, come up with a couple of good products, or just stay pat.
Yeah, they had a blockbuster product that was making money. The company was actually in good financial health.
And people will tell you
this is not a company that's good in financial health.
People will tell you it was not innovative. I disagree. But that's a different argument altogether when it comes to Apple.
Not innovative?
A lot of people say Apple's not innovative ever since they lost their founder, right? But I think the reality is I disagree with that, first of all. But second of all, if you want to say that, at least you kept the ship going in the direction. It's all about the phone, right? And then all of a sudden, he started to build out more and more about the services, now the wearables and all those other different categories. But he actually had something and continued with what he had.